Hello, this is Paul Hoffer, and I'm giving my response to the prompt. Polemarchus and Thrasymachus provide their own definitions of justice. Glaucon challenges the conclusion offered by Socrates. Talk about the definitions or challenges presented, and Socrates' response to each. Then talk a bit about what you're wondering about or what is confusing at this point. Just a couple things. I'm going to start with the last first. The title of the book is called The Republic. The Greek word is actually politia, which means the city or organization. So I'm wondering why it's called The Republic. Uh, Perhaps we'll find out that later in the book that Plato believes that the uh, best city is a republic or something to that effect, and I guess we'll find out. The second thing that I wonder about is why our translator of the Republic uses the term uh, justice instead of righteousness. The word that is used in the actual text is dikaiosune, which is righteousness or fairness in the treatment of others. Its root word dikaios is acting equitably in character and in deed. And Socrates himself at 352d claims that it's the way we ought to live. So the question is justice and righteousness really the same word? Or are we adding something to that with our 20th century notions of justice, which we see in a more legalistic way? Uh, Getting to the actual prompt itself, we see Socrates going down to the Piraeus, the seaport of Athens. The seaport of Athens was not actually part of the city, it was a couple miles away. And this was the part of the city state where the poor, the immigrants, the non citizens lived. So it's interesting that Socrates is going down to that, and that the people that he's meeting with are a good number of them, anyways, aren't even Athenians. Uh, Cephalus and Polemarchus are not citizens. They are a family of immigrants, wealthy, but they're still immigrants. Uh, Thrasymachus was a famous rhetorician and sophist. He was from Chalcedon. He wasn't from Athens either. On the other hand, we see Plato's brothers, Glaucon and Adeimantus, who were companions of Socrates on this journey down to the Piraeus. And they came from a very wealthy Athenian family. They were definitely citizens of the state. In fact, they could trace their lineage back to Pericles himself, who was the statesman of Athens during its golden age. Socrates, on the other hand, is a rather poor man. We see that in the Apology, where he argues that his fine should be very minimal because he doesn't have anything. Socrates was from a family of stonecutters. So, so we have a rather diverse group of people, and that perhaps is why it's at the Piraeus. So uh, you have a diverse group of people, and seeing how they interact, their different roles, their different functions in Athenian society, and how a just society is going to work as to each of these characters. Now to the prompt itself as to the definition of justice. The first definition of justice that we see comes from Cephalus. Cephalus gives a definition that Socrates refines a little bit and says to speak the truth and pay your debts. And then he gives us an exception to that by arguing about the crazy guy who wants his knife back so he can do harm to himself or others. And Socrates points out that paying your debts, giving back to someone their knife, wouldn't be just here because he's going to use it to harm someone. Kephalus, interestingly, gives a definition of justice that Socrates doesn't expound upon, which is to be moderate and content, to be decent and orderly, and not to owe the gods or another. And this idea of giving each person and God their due is actually something we see in the Catechism of the Catholic Church at 1807. Justice is the moral virtue that consists in the constant and firm will to give their due to God and neighbor. Justice towards God is called the virtue of religion. And indeed, we see that in the Euthyphro, where Socrates asks Euthyphro, is piety a kind of justice, or is justice a kind of piety? And Euthyphro answers to Socrates' satisfaction that piety is a kind of justice. Justice towards men disposes one to respect the rights of each and to establish in human relationships the harmony which promotes equity with regards to person and to the common good. So we see Kephalus give a definition of virtue that should sound familiar to us Catholics, because in a roundabout way, or very close to our definition, he's expounding it, and Socrates doesn't seem to think too much of it. We see another popular definition of justice, at least if we think back to our school days in the schoolyard. He says justice is, Polemarchus thinks that justice is helping one's friends and harming one's enemies, and argues that is what one owes to others. And Socrates defeats that argument by, first of all, showing that it's not true in the context of the subject. He argues that a just person will be good at useless things and being unjust at things that are important, using Polemarchus's definition. Often we don't know who our friends and enemies are, and thus we may treat those that we think are friends rightly, and those we think are enemies wrongly, and actually we might be treating the wrong person the wrong way under Polemarchus's definition, and that would be unjust. Finally, it doesn't seem just to treat anyone badly, not even an enemy. Thrasymachus, who as a sophist, an intellectual, a rhetorician who would be familiar with the powerful of Athens, who has a philosophy that man is the measure of all things, meaning that men decide for themselves what they're going to believe, and that basically he takes a realistic approach to justice, one that we seem to see on television and other things every day, that justice is the advantage or what is beneficial to the stronger. That's at 338C. He then argues that justice is different in tyrannies and aristocracies and democracies, depending on who's making the laws and the people that are being ruled, and that laws are made to serve the interests of the rulers of each regime. And Socrates then tries to refute that by arguing or getting Thrasymachus to define what rule means in the context of justice. And is it that the stronger think what is beneficial to them, or what is actually beneficial to them? After all, rulers make mistakes. Thrasymachus excoriates Socrates by pointing out to Socrates that now Socrates is attempting to change definitions, because a definition, after all, is the highest or best form of a virtue or a thing, and if a ruler was a perfect ruler, they're never going to make a mistake. Socrates then responds to that by discussing art and craftsmanship, with the aim that the artist or musician or craftsman engages in is doing good for its subject and not what is good for the practitioner. For example, he gave a doctor practices medicine to heal the sick, not make money for himself. A captain does not rule the boat, but the sailors who sail the boat. He argues that the craftsman seeks not his own advantage, but the advantage of the subject of his craft. For example, with the musician tuning his lyre, he's not going to try to tune it better than other people. He's going to try to tune it the best he can, make the best music he's going to do. He's not trying to outdo the other musicians. Looking at it from that perspective, Socrates then seems to demonstrate that the stronger serves the weaker. The ruler's advantage is what is earned in response to of the weaker to the service provided by the ruler. And Thrasymachus then tries to refute this notion by arguing that some arts, such as shepherds, while they do care for the sheep, ultimately do so for their own personal advantage. After all, the sheep is the one that's going to get fleeced for the benefit of the shepherd or the owner of the sheep. He's the one that's going to get cooked. He's the one that's going to get sold, not the shepherd. So justice is the good of the other who does what is advantageous to the stronger or ruler, which is harmful to himself. For example, the fatter the sheep's going to get, the sooner he's going to get slaughtered. The more fleecy the sheep gets, the sooner he's going to get sheared. Thrasymachus argues that injustice on a sufficiently large scale is stronger, freer, and more masterful than justice, and is the advantage of the stronger, that is, the just, while the unjust is what profits man's self and is for his advantage. And then he goes on to argue that the paragon of a happy, unjust person is a tyrant who is able to satisfy all their desires and never get overthrown or caught. Socrates goes back and tries to show that the shepherd's concern for his sheep is different than the shepherd's concern to make money. It's something extraneous to the art itself. No power art provides what is beneficial to itself. Art's not going to make its own money. It's going to make art. And then if the person decides to take that art and then sell it, that's something that's an additional to the art. And Socrates argues that that's true of rulers. They then wrangle over whether rulers are really truly want to rule or not. Socrates claims that the best rulers are reluctant to rule, but do so out of necessity. They do not wish to be ruled by someone inferior. They don't want to pay a penalty. They're not doing it for money or honor. They're doing it because of that penalty. On the other hand, money or honor or power is actually something that's given to the ruler as an inducement to overcome their reluctance to rule. And that's how Socrates sees it. He really argues that a true ruler doesn't seek his own advantage, but that of his subjects. That's at 347d. The discussion then moves on to whether it's more profitable to be just or unjust. Socrates proves it is more profitable to be just than unjust by showing that the just man is wise and good, and the just man is ignorant and bad. Injustice produces internal disharmony, which prevents effective actions. When two crooks work together to rob somebody, Socrates argues basically that there's a form of justice between the two robbers, because otherwise they wouldn't be able to rob in concert, because if they were totally unjust, they'd be trying to rob each other at the same time that they're robbing their victim. That prevents effective actions if they're totally unjust. So injustice is not really a thing itself, it's more of an absence of justice. The less justice there is, the more unjust the person's going to be. He also argues that virtue, or arete, is the excellence or summit of a thing's function, and a just person lives a happier life than an unjust person, since he performs the various functions of the human soul well. That's a 352D. There's still some dissatisfaction in the discussion, because while they got off on a tangent, they haven't discussed really what justice is by itself. Glaucon, at the beginning of Book 2, talks about how he's not satisfied and demands that Socrates provides a better definition, and to show that it's more profitably just than opposed to being unjust. And Glaucon argues categories, and he divides good things into three classes: that there are things that are good in themselves, things that are good both in themselves and their consequences, and things that are good only for their consequences. He places justice in that last category. Socrates tries to put it in the best category, that justice is good in itself and in its consequences. And then they set out a plan to prove that by showing how justice would work in a city, and if the definition of justice in that context would then work for an individual in an individual's life. They used the example of taking the larger writing, the city, and comparing it to the smaller writing, or the individual. Then at that point, they set out to construct their city, and they start by populating the city with various classes of people, various functions, various roles, art, etc., and discuss the next step is how art is going to play in that city. My question at this point is, if there is a common notion of justice for all, a common good, so to speak, why does it seem that Socrates wants to give some folks some advantages and benefits that he's not offering to the other groups? Why does he seem to offer the guardians one thing, the craftsmen another thing, the people in between a different thing after that? Is justice the same for everyone, or is it different based on how you're predetermining what their due is? With that, I am done, and I look forward to hearing from all of you. Thank you. Bye.